Good morning, church. My name is Pastor Anne Marie, and we are so happy to have you in this 11:11 service this morning. I left you in very good hands last week with Will because I had a very important appointment. I had to go hold a 2-week-old baby. And if you're mad about that, you can fight the baby. That seems like that's on you. But this morning, we are in the midst of a transition. We're in a new season. We have celebrated Easter in like Will talked about last week. We are now on a road that leads to the ascension of Christ, when he is lifted up and takes his place by the Father. And then following the ascension, we reach Pentecost, the day when the Spirit is given to humankind and the church is born. So we're in this season, this new transition, and it's a particularly important moment for the disciples. Because up until this point, they had been following their teacher. They were disciples, they were followers. And where Jesus went, they went. But the events of Easter have occurred. And although Christ is risen, he's no longer always with them. And in this road between Easter, the Ascension, and Pentecost, these disciples are going to learn what it means to be followers of Jesus when he isn't physically present. They're going to go from being these followers of this new movement that Jesus is creating, this new creation that's blooming, to being the leaders of it. And so throughout this journey, we're going to be looking at what they're learning between Easter, the Ascension, and Pentecost. And it's kind of a walk. It's a trail, if you will. You can learn a lot about yourself on a long hike or a long walk, as we learned from Will last week. I learned that Will has really incredible determination when it comes to hiking, so much more than I do. I learned that his mom is maybe the best sport in the whole world. Anyone who falls down on the trail and then lets you take a picture of them, that's a win in my book. But I've learned a lot of really important things about myself and my loved ones on a hike or on a walk. In fact, it was on a hike that I learned something really important about my husband, Leighton. It was one of our first trips together. We went to Arkansas to visit his family, where they're all from. And we had a lot of great time spending time with them, eating really good food that you're not allowed to know the caloric content of. And we spent one day in nature. Arkansas is home to some really beautiful land, and so we spent one day hiking Mount Pinnacle. This is not a super strenuous hike, but it's got some steep points, some loose rock, and I'm not an excellent hiker. I fall down every once in a while, but the views were so worth it. But it was when we were at the top, celebrating our victory, the way that we had journeyed all the way, that it happened. We were standing there at the pinnacle of Mount Pinnacle, and not 20 yards away, lightning struck. And it began to rain like we were going to need an ark. And so naturally, being the very cool, calm, collected person that I am, I started to freak out. I turned to Leighton and said, "How are we going to make it down? The trail is now wet. I fell on the way up. Do you know how much worse this is going to be? Are we going to be okay?" And Leighton is so calm. I mean, I don't think his heartbeat was raised even a little bit. In his nonchalant voice, he was like, "This is going to be fine. This is Arkansas. Pop-up thunderstorms happen. We're just going to go slow, take a breath. We will get there." And he wasn't fazed at all. So I start to kind of simmer down. I think, okay, this is not a big deal to him. This is just not a big deal. It'll be fine. And so we made our way very slowly down the path until we get to one particularly hard place where the rocks are kind of loose and it's a little steep. You kind of had to scramble up a little bit. And I've slipped a couple of times, but this is where it got a little dicey. And so for 30 minutes, Leighton would take one step, and then I would take that same step, and then he would take one step, and I would take that same step and slip, and then I'd get back up. And we did that for a while, but we made it down to the bottom. And when we did, I turned to Leighton and said, "Okay, you were right. I didn't need to be scared. We were all going to be totally fine the whole time. Thank you for keeping calm. And he turns to me and says, I have never been so afraid in my entire life. I learned something really important about my future spouse that day. I married a liar. No, not at all. I married a very cool, calm, collected person under pressure, exactly who you want on your team. But if you are his students and he says your test is going to be easy, maybe you don't believe him. I don't know. But along the trail, along the long walks, we learn a lot about ourselves. And we're on this long walk, this journey from Easter to the Ascension to Pentecost. And so here we're going to pick up our story of the disciples on Easter evening, the first time we see the resurrected Christ appear. And each time we do, we find him teaching them something about what it means to become these new leaders of this new creation he's building. Something in this long walk that teaches us something about God, something about ourselves, something about who we're called to be. And so we're going to start our journey on the walk to Emmaus. This is picking up in Luke 24, verses 13. These events occur on the evening of Easter morning. The disciples have seen an empty tomb, but haven't yet witnessed the risen Christ. So we're going to notice what this text teaches us about what it means to live as Easter people. This is from Luke 24, starting in verse 13. Now on that same day, 2 of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. And while they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other as you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women from our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of us who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he, Jesus, said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. So we have 2 disciples walking along the road. They had most likely come to Jerusalem for the events of the Passover, and then witnessing all that happened with Christ's death, stayed an extra day through the Sabbath, and are now making their way home, or to where they were staying in Emmaus. And this story of what occurs on that 7-mile walk from Jerusalem to Emmaus, I think tells us 2 things about what it means to follow Christ as Easter people. First, we share how faith has changed our life. Biblical scholars and teachers, Sunday school teachers love this story because it demonstrates someone sharing their faith. As these people are walking along to Emmaus, the disciples share, unbeknownst to them, to Jesus, the contents of the gospel. For the first time, they relay everything that they had thought about Jesus, who he was, what they had thought he had come to do. And even though they don't get it all right, they share what they had learned about God. When I was in seminary, the importance of sharing our faith was conveyed to me in a lot of different ways. For example, I had one professor who said, if you're going to share your faith, you need to be able to do it in under 2 minutes. Elevator pitch style. Give us the gospel. I wasn't very good at that. And then other teachers would tell us to write 50, 60, 70 pages of what we know about God, ourselves, where this all is heading. I didn't like that either. But we have a way of sharing our faith here at FUMC Colleyville that I think makes a little bit more sense to me. Over the last few weeks, through the concentrated efforts of people much more tech savvy than I am, many of our God at Work videos have come up on our website. So y'all remember, these are the stories that people in our congregation have been willing to share about who they have understood God to be through their own lives, reminding us that we don't have to know everything, but we can share who God has been to us. And even if we weren't there in person to witness the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, we get to share how those events have taken place in our own hearts. And I think that's exactly what Cleopas was doing. He was sharing his own understanding of who Christ was. And Jesus, unknown to him, does the exact same thing back. He interprets his understanding of his own calling as the Messiah through all the scriptures. This is the first thing that we see Jesus do in his newly resurrected form after Easter. The first thing is hear an understanding of who he is and then share one in return. So maybe that can invite us as Easter people to share our own faith, who God has been to us, who we understand God to be, where God has shown up, what our story is. So that's the first thing we learn about being Easter people on this road to the Ascension and Pentecost, that we're called to share how faith has changed our lives. But there's a second thing. We're called to share how faith has changed our lives, but then also to share our life of faith. In the days following Easter, Jesus doesn't appear everywhere or to everybody. So every time we see the risen Christ appear somewhere, we get to ask, why there? Why those people? Why that situation? And as I sat with the text this week, the image that I just could not get out of my mind were those two friends walking along the road, sharing at the very beginning of the story. In verse 13, it says, "Now on that same day, two of them were walking towards a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened." And later on, as they tell Jesus about Jesus' own events, they say in verse 19, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel." And I love that. I love that image, because it's not just sharing our understanding of faith. It's sharing our life of faith. The honesty that the disciples have with each other and with this person along the road. They're sharing their disappointment. Here's who I thought Jesus was. And they don't have the full story yet, but they're sharing their truth. We had thought he was this person. They share their grief and their doubt and their uncertainty, and they share it boldly. And I wonder, friends, if we aren't being invited to do the same. We share our stories of who God has been, who we know God to be. But in this life of faith, we're also called to share the realities of our life, not just the good parts. We're called to share our own grief, our own disappointment, our own questions, our own "we had hoped." So we see with two friends walking along the road, sharing the truth of their life and their faith together. And I don't know if it's ever been more important than right now. This last year, the Surgeon General put out a health warning for the American people. You might have read this. The health warning that he put out, I have to be honest with y'all, I think about maybe once a day because it was so severe. The statistics are insane. It's a health condition associated with greater risk of cardiovascular disease, of stroke, of dementia, depression, anxiety, and even premature death. The intensity of this condition does the same effect on the body, caused similarly as if you were to smoke 15 cigarettes a day. And if you've read this report, you already know. But the epidemic that he's referring to is loneliness and isolation. And the Surgeon General put out a 70-page report on how most Americans, feel lonely. How most people feel isolated from their communities. And there are all kinds of things that we could get into that factor into this. Certainly social media, the pandemic, all other kinds of things, but this is now our reality. Most people feel lonely. Most people feel isolated. And friends, at the heart of our faith, not in addition, but at the core, is that we are created to live together. That in Easter, God takes everything that could separate us from God and everything that could separate us from one another and clears it away through Jesus Christ. So that we can be in communion. And as these two friends walk along the road, they don't let their doubts or certainties or grief or questions get in the way of sharing their life of faith together. Friends, who do you need to reach out to? Who do you need to go on a walk with and share how you're doing? Even if it isn't Easter lilies and egg hunts. Who do you need to reach out to and check on? Who do you know that's lonely? It might be people that you wouldn't expect. Because friends, this is our calling. Because of what Christ has done, we are bound together. And that's good news. We get to share our stories of how faith has changed our life. But then we get to share our life of faith together. After the disciples in the hidden Christ share their faith, they complete their journey, and their story closes like this. Picking up in verse 28. It says, as they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over. So they went in to stay with him. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, were our hearts not burning within us when he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us? That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, the Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon. Then they told them what had happened on the road, how he had been made known to them in the breaking of bread. Friends, this time on the road has revealed our call, that we're invited to share our stories, how faith has changed our life, but also to share our life of faith, whatever it looks like, knowing that when we do so, every once in a while, our eyes are cleared, and we find that we were never traveling alone. Christ has always been walking with us. May it ever be so. Amen.